And we begin tonight with the latest on the shooting of Trayvon Martin. New details emerging today about those first crucial hours of the investigation and the decision not to press charges against the shooter. Well, we're in first position now with the very latest. Just hours after this howling fight and the gunshot that killed Trayvon Martin, the homicide officer investigating the case recommended that George Zimmerman be brought up on manslaughter charges. But when the officers sent it to the state's attorney, that very night it was reportedly rejected, with a concern that there wasn't enough evidence to convict. A fear later compounded by possible police missteps, including the failure to test Zimmerman that night for drugs or alcohol. Zimmerman claimed self-defense, but that night he spotted Martin, followed him, and he called the police.
Are you following him?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't need you to do that.
He then claimed to turn back to go to his truck, and that's when Zimmerman reportedly says Martin confronted him, ultimately punching Zimmerman in the nose, pouncing and slamming his head on the ground. The original police report classified the shooting as an unnecessary killing to prevent an unlawful act, which means police originally thought Martin may have attacked Zimmerman first, something never proven.
He sadly missed.
Trayvon Martin's parents said their son would still be alive had he not been the victim of racial profiling.
Of course, my heart is broken, but it breaks even more to know that we have not gotten justice yet.
And the family says their son is still being victimized.
There are so many things now where they're trying to just blame the victim, demonize the victim.
And today on Capitol Hill, Representative Bobby Rush, Democrat from Illinois, took to the House floor in a hoodie in a show of support for Trayvon Martin. He was kicked off the House floor for improper dress code. And joining us now to talk about not just the death of Trayvon Martin, but so much more is Governor David Paterson, former governor of the state of New York, as you know, and current host of the Governor David Paterson Show on WOR Radio. Welcome. I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you.
Well, nice to be here, Richard.
Well, first off, did you ever think a couple of years ago you'd be joining the ranks of the people you're trying to avoid like the plague?
Well, I might have thought that, but everybody else thought that I would wind up in this medium, and that's exactly what happened.
So 6 months into it, is it what you expect here? Do you sympathize more with the media than you might have before, or what's your take on it?
I sympathize with the media in the sense that every day you've got to come up with 2 hours of material. But I would say I am even more convinced that there are some sensational people in the media, just as there are in politics, and then there's some absolutely horrible people in the media, just as there are in politics. But the media always likes to lecture the other politicians about not casting out our bad apples and can't do it themselves.
I think that's more than fair, and I think we could make a little list after the show who would fit those ranks. I want to talk about what I'm sure you've discussed in your program, Trayvon Martin, and I know not only have you discussed it, but you went and spoke at a rally in Florida. You also donated $2,000 to the family of Trayvon Martin. Do me a favor, talk about it first from the perspective of a black man in America. You've got a son yourself here. We've had a lot of folks here on the set, whether people of cloth or to a person, they've all talked about the talk that they had or got as a kid, and how the shooting wasn't just the single shooting in Florida, it was about so much more.
Well, you're right. My son was 17 the night of the NBA All-Star game, which is a little more than a month ago. And he went out that night as well. He also didn't come home, and we had to call and, finally found him and got him to come home. So it's a standard problem that you have with 17-year-olds. But the next day he celebrated his 18th birthday, and unfortunately the parents of Trayvon Martin, whose names are Tracy Martin and Sabrina Fulton, were making funeral arrangements for their son, seemingly as unnecessarily as any situation that you'll hear about for a long period of time. So, my counsel to anyone is that if you're stopped by the police, that the best thing to do is to cooperate. Now, if you actually read what the law compels you to do, It's very little. You don't really have to answer questions. You do not have to be subjected to a frisk unless there is some kind of an active investigation for which you seem to fit the profile of a subject. And, but you don't know whether that's going to be made up or not. So my view is when you're under the control of anyone, that the best thing to do is to submit, because things will turn out better that way. But what makes this case different was Trayvon Martin wasn't stopped by a police officer. He was stopped by a person who was on a watch patrol, a person who never registered the watch patrol, a person who was carrying a weapon on the watch patrol, which is against regulations, and who further ignored the heed of an EMS operator. So in other words, the police said, leave the subject alone, because as soon as he calls 911, George Zimmerman made Trayvon Martin the subject of a police investigation. He now belongs to the police, even though he's walking down the street and doesn't know it. When George Zimmerman goes over and intervenes, he actually now interferes with the investigation, which, and don't be surprised when you see him charged with that. But the first thing, according to the witness who Trayvon was talking to on the telephone, the first thing that Trayvon Martin says to him is, "Why are you following me?" He doesn't answer the question. He decides to ask his own question. What are you doing here? Well, you see, I think what we've missed about this whole case is that I get the feeling from everything Trayvon Martin was saying to his friend over the phone for the last 5 minutes that he didn't think he was being pursued by the police. He may have not even had any idea there is such a thing as a neighborhood watch patrol. He thought he was being attacked by a potential criminal. And that's probably why they wound up having a fight, one they wouldn't have had if this individual had listened to the police.
When we hear dialogue and debate, you've heard the hoodie comments that, hey, the hoodie contributed to half of the tragedy that night. In fact, there was a comment from an officer now suspended in New Orleans who say, live like a thug, die like a thug. What's your reaction? Are these just two people spouting off, or are they emblematic of a perception issue that's going on in this country?
My reaction is almost every ethnic group in this country knows what it is about them that is perceived to offend other people. It's the subject of stereotypical jokes, and it is and should be disqualified from any determination of guilt or innocence prior to an investigation. So there are, in New York City, hundreds of thousands of people stopped. 95% of them aren't doing anything wrong, and 99.5% of them aren't carrying a weapon. So in those particular situations, you've got to conclude that if someone's wearing a hoodie these days, they're probably somebody that would have had an afro 30 years ago, and they probably would have had slick back hair 40 years ago, and they might have worn dashikis 40 years ago. All it tells you is that they're part of a culture, and it's not necessarily a black culture. Asians, Hispanics, whites, you see them. It's kind of the kind of hip-hop culture of the day. People wear hoodies. Tomorrow they'll be wearing something else, and that will be the profiling subject. So, you know, what's interesting is that there are other groups, Italians, who feel that they get stereotyped, and that's why they don't like these programs that further the stereotyping, like The Sopranos and Jersey Shore. And certainly the Irish always get blamed for all the drinking on St. Patrick's Day. And young African-American males get blamed for all the crime. And it isn't that they don't play a significant part in the numbers of people who get arrested and convicted for committing crimes. But at the same time, an individual walking down the street who's not bothering anyone cannot and should not be immediately assessed, as the 911 tape shows George Zimmerman did. As
well, that segues us to stop and frisk in New York. And as governor, you made sure that the names of everybody that were stopped and not charged with anything were deleted or not kept on the records. You're not sitting in Albany right now. Your perspective of stop and frisk, does it do more harm than good? in terms of how communities look at the police and that the net benefit versus the net cost?
Probably does more harm than good. But there would be some ways to clean it up. Someone suggested that police officers carry a card. And when they stop and frisk someone, and if they found not to do anything wrong, they'd say to the individual, by the way, if there's anything that you think was improper about the search, here's a card. You can contact the Civilian Complaint Review Board. Now, it's not that all that many people would even use the card. Some people take the card and throw it away. Some people refuse to take the card. But we just want to keep good police-community relations alive. And unfortunately, too many people in the neighborhood don't understand what the police are trying to accomplish. And too many police officers, many of them who don't live in the same neighborhoods as the individuals that they protect. And that's a serious problem. And I've got to tell you, we started a situation at the 28th and 30th precincts in the New York City Police Department. Actually, it was all over. But at the time I was a state senator, we would go in and talk to the new officers. And I could tell the new officers something that maybe the other elected officials couldn't. That I didn't grow up in Harlem. I grew up in Long Island. I grew up in Hempstead. When I first moved into Harlem, I was so afraid of all the stereotypical conduct that I had heard that, you know, if I heard a loud noise, I wouldn't come out of my apartment for a while. But as time went on, I started to find the culture of that particular neighborhood. People in Harlem are probably the friendliest people you'll ever meet. They talk to you while you're walking down the street, you know. Nice suit, you know, like I grew up in Long Island. We never said a word. Even the people we knew, we passed them in the street. It's just a different culture. No one's doing anything right or wrong. And, but the police officers don't know the culture because they don't live there. So I think that the stop and frisk needs to be more defined. You just don't stop everybody who has a hoodie on.
As an elected official, President Obama said, it's probably something you could relate to. He said, hey, you know, in this case, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon Martin. There was immediate reaction even by some of the Republican presidential hopefuls saying that he was pouring gas on the fire, if you will, of a very sensitive situation. Where, and you were governor, and there was controversial shootings at the time, you know, while you were governor. Where does the line start and stop in terms of, you know, you got the bully pulpit. How can you use it, and how should you use it in these situations?
I think it was used very properly by the president. I've been a critic of him as to how he's handling the economy and how he's handling foreign policy. But I got to say on this one, when there is a tragedy and you're trying to pull the country together, you're not just trying to pull the people together who aren't involved. You're trying to go to the source of the pain. The source of the pain when we lose people overseas are military families. You're speaking to America, but you're specifically speaking to military families. When we have a disaster, you're talking to people, let's say it's a hurricane. You're not just talking to the country about the terrible damage and the number of deaths that may have occurred. You're talking to people who live in the path of hurricanes. So what President Obama did was he went out of his way to relate to the people who feel that there is no voice, to the parents who feel that their children who've escaped poverty, who've escaped violence, who've escaped getting other teenagers pregnant or alcoholism or drug abuse, and their child gets shot down, not even by the police, but by another civilian who thinks he's Rambo. What you're saying to that family is, you know something? If I had a son, they might have stopped him too. Well, I just said earlier in this program, I have a son. He was out that night. Could have been him. I felt very touched by the remarks. Before Speaker Gingrich demands equity from the president, I would suggest that he come to the table with clean hands. When you call a president a food stamp president and then say you're going to the NAACP to ask them why they would support a black candidate who let the unemployment rate go up, I don't think you should comment on this subject at all.
Last question on Trayvon Martin.
Do you think I answered this question?
I think you did. I get the sense, and certainly the defense for Mr. Zimmerman is doing what most attorneys do, in that they're casting doubt on the situation. But in the process, you're starting to hear some sullying of the name of Trayvon Martin, suspension apparently he got in school for some residue of marijuana, et cetera, and now you're hearing different accounts that night. I get the sense that people should tread carefully here because the undercurrent of anger and frustration, if Zimmerman never spends a day in jail, and people don't think that the system was set up to give Martin's family a shot at justice, there's going to be a lot of angry people in this country. Do you feel that same kind of anger, that people ought to be real careful how we handle the next few months here?
Well, I'd like to try to ease some of the passion and the tension.
But it's out there, isn't it?
Down the line, Zimmerman is going to spend some time in jail because he obstructed an investigation. Number one, he did that. Even he admits that he did that, and he's on the 911 tape telling the policeman he hears him. Okay, I won't go over there, but he does go over there. So he's going to spend some time in jail for something. You can write that down. However, both Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin are in the same position. It's a highly publicized national case. Anything either one of them ever did in the past is going to get drawn into this case. And both individuals who are human beings and have probably made mistakes in their life, Zimmerman made a ton of them that night, are the mistakes that they made in the past are not necessarily in any way related to what happened that evening. If Trayvon Martin had a criminal record and he was walking down the street not bothering anyone and was not a fugitive, then it's no more justifiable than it is now. And this was the beauty of Dr. Martin Luther King. He would only use subjects of an investigation who was squeaky clean. There were a number of people who didn't sit in the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The first victim that Dr. King went to see, he couldn't defend her because she was an unwed mother. In 2012, that would mean nothing now. In 1955, that would have been the whole conversation, that she's an unwed mother. The second victim that Dr. King went to see was also a woman who wouldn't sit in the back of the bus. He couldn't help her because she assaulted the police when they were taking her off the bus. So we would wish that the victims are totally clean, and Rosa Parks was a community person involved in her local NAACP. No one ever had anything to say about Rosa Parks. But this conversation is not about who is the purest among us. This conversation is about correct procedures in dealing with other human beings. And obviously, watch patrols have set parameters for their involvement, all of which George Zimmerman violated. So the kid was 17. I think the family and the advocates were overly defensive about the fact that there was a plastic bag that had marijuana residue in his knapsack, and he got a 5-day in-house suspension. He has no arrest record, no criminal record, and when whoever he was and however he feels, he was walking down the street and made a phone call to a friend saying, "I'm afraid somebody's following me." And that could happen to anybody, regardless of their previous existence.
All right, Governor, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation, so please stay with us. Let's talk about Albany. How do you think the governor's doing right now? You see the approval ratings, all of a sudden Albany's agreeing on stuff that you know better than me. They couldn't agree on what time it was before. What's going on in the Capital District? Because for a lot of people, they can't even recognize it.
A+. The governor has been outstanding. He gives no quarter to the legislature. He has toned down the sort of circus atmosphere of Albany. You notice, sorry guys, but you notice he doesn't give very many interviews, doesn't talk to too many people. And the reason is, I believe that he figured out that it was just exacerbating the acrimony on both sides. It was this little era we went through in Albany where everything had to be open, everything had to be transparent. Leaders' meetings, when you're trying to negotiate budgets, cannot be held in public because the minute you make a concession, you've offended people. You don't see it when unions and management just talk in this country, and you don't see President Obama negotiating with Speaker Boehner on television. But we had that going on in Albany, and some of us who really believed in open government bought into it, and we were wrong. Now you can see the results of a governor who spends 100% of his time on laws and on improving the quality of life in the state of New York instead of pleasing a couple of whining good government group people. And what he's been able to accomplish is to, I think, bring the finances of the state completely under control. He has passed landmark legislation like marriage equality for gay and lesbian citizens. He has been able to create a new higher educational system at SUNY, where we will have 4 centers of learning that will compete with anywhere in the country. The governor has come to an agreement on taxation and at the same time budget cutting. He's reeled in some of the Albany bullies who were special interests that thought that they were running the government, not the legislature. And he has done it with a carrot and a stick, which is masterful. And I tell you, with all the talk about these tough governors, like one on the bordering state and others, and I actually like Governor Christie, but I don't think that you're seeing effective leadership results. This man is passing a budget not just on time. We've waited a whole generation to see somebody pass a budget on time. He passes the budgets early. So,
I got to tell you,
doesn't get better than that.
we sat at this table with a lot of the guys, and we said we wouldn't wish what you had to deal with on our worst enemy with the likes of the Pedro Espadas and the Montserrats and all the rest, where forget about wouldn't want him to be your elected official. You wouldn't want to sit at the same table with these guys. Were they the anomaly, or are there still a lot of folks like that in Albany, forget about their own constituents, they don't even have the best state's interests at heart?
Well, sometimes there is a constellation of events that, let's just say, are not working to the advantage of anyone who is in the executive branch. And during that period, 2007, 2008, 2009, that was when the full impacts of the recession hit. That was when we had a leadership crisis in the state because the governor had to resign. And so, for instance, people say to me, when there was an open Senate seat, why didn't you appoint yourself? And I tell them I couldn't because I didn't have a lieutenant governor. And I thought that if I appointed myself to the United States Senate, we wouldn't even know who's governing the state, because those 4 or 5 senators who were weaving back and forth, only submitting their vote to the candidate who promised to give them the most. By the way, how are you a Democratic senator and then become the majority leader in the Republican conference in a week? Because the need to want to be in the majority was so great that they actually allowed themselves to be coerced and in many respects to be blackmailed. And it was an unfortunate thing, and that's why in July of 2009, I appointed a lieutenant governor, and the court sustained it, Richard Ravitch. But yes, believe me, for those who said they would not have wanted to be in my shoes during that whole period, believe me, they would not want to be.
A couple other issues here. Obviously, November fast approaching. What's your gut tell you about how not only the president's going to do, but how races both on the House and Senate level look here? It looks like Gillibrand's going to coast in New York, but he got a lot of contentious House races, and a lot of people say it could be top of the ticket's going to decide it one way or the other.
3 things. Now that I'm on WR, there is a presumption that because I was a Democrat, I'm just going to defend Democrats. And I think if you listen to the show, you find that I don't do that. I try to be as objective as possible. I think President Obama has done everything to assure that he would not be reelected this year, but he will be, because the Republican Party can't find a candidate who actually can focus on the issues where the president would be vulnerable. President Obama will be reelected. It won't even be close.
And will that have coattails, you think?
No, because the Republicans are going to win the United States Senate. They'll maintain the House. The president will now govern with 2 parties who are actually against his point of view for his second term. And Kirsten Gillibrand, who I was vilified for appointing U.S. Senate, they won't get a candidate. They can get 40% of the vote against her. So the people who wrote those columns can explain it to the 60% of the public that will re-elect her.
Finally, you're a sports fan like myself, and unfortunately, you're a Jet fan like myself. A year from now, we sit down, we say, you know, whether they did it for the right reason or trying to sell PSLs, was the Tebow move a stroke of genius, or did it just add more dysfunction to a dysfunctional locker room?
I would say that the Jets have created a circus atmosphere, but the Tebow appointment was an act of opportunity more than it was wisdom or poor judgment. These are the things you have to know. Number one, Tim Tebow, if you compare the two of us, I have a better arm. Tim Tebow is not a natural quarterback, and he can't throw. Number two, if the Denver Broncos didn't have such a great defense, you would never have heard of Tim Tebow because they would have lost all those games. He wasn't winning games 35-32 or something. They were winning games 13-7, 15-10. But the third thing you've got to know, Tim Tebow, with the possible exception of Michael Vick, may be the best running quarterback in the history of the NFL. So if you can't throw, but you run great, you put that player with a quarterback who throws well, but often has bad judgment, Mark Sanchez. And you take the two mediocrities and put them together, and I think that the Jets may not be the Super Bowl champions next year because they have other problems, like an offensive line that needs repair. But when you look up next year, people will not fault the Jets for having made the trade for Tim Tebow. And what did they give up for him? A fourth-round draft pick.
Exactly.
Hey, Richard, who was the Jets' fourth-round draft pick last year?
I'm struggling to remember myself.
I rest my case.
Yes, fair enough. Now, Governor, before you go, we hear you're involved with a roundtable, as we said, on OR Radio here. You're doing this, as you said, 2 hours a night. Tell everybody about it real quickly if they tune in, what they're going to hear.
We're going to do it on April the 5th from 4 to 7 p.m. at the historic Russian Tea Room. People are invited to come down and watch.
A little borscht, right?
A little borscht, and we will be talking about the issues of education and healthcare and homeland security, the major issues of our time. The stop and frisk issue will be part of it. It's part of homeland security, and obviously the struggles that the mayor and the police commissioner and the elected officials of New Jersey have had. And we'll have a pretty good discussion. My show is 4 to 6 on 710 AM WOR, but this will be an extra hour, 4 to 7, and we will have, for the first time, elected officials from the tri-state area, from Connecticut, New Jersey, as well as New York, talking about those major issues in a three-pronged discussion of what's important in the metropolitan area right now.
All right, good enough. And Governor, I want to thank you for a few minutes. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Richard.
We'll be right back, everybody. Please stay with us.